Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and our guest today is George Segal, who rose to international prominence with his elaborate tableaus by life casting contemporary figures in everyday settings. A very warm welcome to you. Why don't we begin at least the beginning of your career, and that is, can you tell us how a painter's concerns are successfully pursued in sculpture? Why did you abandon painting for sculpture?
I studied painting in New York, seriously at NYU. My art teachers were Basiotes and Tony Smith. Basiotes used to get after me and say, jump on the bandwagon of the history of art with us, throw those tiny paintbrushes away, buy 5-inch house painter's brushes, stretch a couple of big canvases, and paint these big abstract paintings, and I didn't know how. And
what did your work look like then?
I used to bring apples and bananas, and they were my earliest paintings looked like very stiff derivative Cézannes. Started out loving Cézanne, Matisse. Ended up hero-worshipping de Kooning. I thought the abstract painting was magnificent. I found them philosophers, passionate, intense, intelligent, couldn't understand a stroke on the canvas, couldn't understand what the abstraction was about. But I loved their studios, I loved their throwing away materialism, and I loved their enormous ambition to make great art. You know, they really wanted to challenge and surpass School of Paris, which I loved also. They shut too many doors for me. I'm tactile. I love to see things, I love to touch things, I love to grasp them, possess them. I'm sensual. I do believe in the world immediately outside my skin. I'm knocked out by the look of things. Still, you know, I'm still in love with the look of New York. And I got it into my head that their paintings were about what was inside your skin. They were trying to make concrete or tangible or visible what was inside their heads, their bodies. I struggled, floundered. You know, it was acceptance, rejection of these men, and I love them. You know, I love their work, and I love them all.
You spent a lot of time with them at their club?
Yes. Yeah, and it took me years.
For more than 35 years, you've lived in rural New Jersey, very close to Rutgers University, and very close to a man who was a long-term friend of yours, and I assume an influence as well. I'm referring to Alan Capro.
Capro was and still is close friend. Capro was a young painter then, in those years, and a young art historian who had just gotten a job teaching history of art at Rutgers, fresh out of Meyer Shapiro and Hans Hofmann. We were introduced to each other, and we discovered that I had gone to NYU. We knew about a dozen artists our own age in common, and we had never met, you know, while at the time both of us were studying in New York. So we had this great common ground, and he also accidentally moved a mile away from me, and I was chicken farmer at the time.
We'll get to that later.
All right, that's how I was making my living. I was chicken farmer and I was painting. Capro was painting, and we discovered that we had come from the same corner of the art world, knew the same people, liked the same kind of art, and we had the same reservations about abstract art. And we were both determined to forge an art theory and a way of working that would challenge and surpass abstract expressionism. Good heavens. And we self-mockingly called ourselves the New Brunswick School of Painting. Okay. Capro did invent happenings. The whole idea of painters' theater, which was live people performing a series of movements or actions in real space with real objects, except that there was no narrative, there was no word logic, and it was about aesthetic imagery, and had a lot of rhythm, and it was based on a set of ground rules. Well, you had to go to Marcel Duchamp, you had to go to Surrealist theory, you had to go to some of André Breton's ideas, you had to go to Italian Futurism, you had to go to Marinetti. There's a long history, a long line of things that had been done in Europe, rather obscurely with different intentions by some marvelous European artists that were at the root of an awful lot of American art. If we're going to be straight and honest about it. I quarreled with Capro about the ground rules of happenings. I didn't want to do it that way. I hated the idea of stopping work with my hands. My whole objection to abstract art was I had no room for my own tactility. I wanted to keep working with my hands. I didn't like the idea of becoming a movie director or a play director. I didn't like depending on so many other people outside of myself to do a brief performance. I wanted to make work that I could come back to later and enter, walk around, and contemplate. No, I logically was backed into a corner. I stopped painting because the injunctions of repressing figuration and keeping the canvas flat, I felt were absolutely arbitrary limitations. Who said so? Who was the authority? Why was that so critically necessary to 20th century avant-garde art? The only place I could go was forward. And I decided, again arbitrarily, to go into my own space. This is space I could step into.
One of the things you did in the interim, when you decided to stop painting, was literally to go into your own space. Perhaps you might tell us what a nice Jewish boy like you was doing being a chicken farmer.
Trying to survive.
How did that happen?
It was pretty simple and natural, if you look at the history. My father used to be a butcher in the Bronx. He was idealist, he was Zionist, he was socialist. One of the great dreams of his life was to buy his own land and farm his own place. When I was about 14, he sold his butcher shop in the Bronx and bought this little swampy piece of ground that no self-respecting farmer would farm, build buildings for chickens. So I was a kid. I moved out with him, and by the time I graduated, there were no teaching jobs. So it was, I was married. My wife was pregnant, and about the quickest thing I could do was to build my own farm. So I did that. I was living in a house across the street from my father's, and I had 3 acres, and that was enough. I knew how to do all that stuff, so I did that. I built my own farm building and raised chickens, sold eggs, and painted in my attic.
How did the work evolve to its present form? How did you arrive at plaster as a material?
I was flat broke. Where was I going to find marble? Who could afford bronze? Come on. We were flat broke. My friends were my happening friends were con artists. They're always looking for someone with $800 or $1,000 to finance a happening. And I said, it's demeaning to go around begging that kind of money, for a one-time shot. And I'd go to a junkyard and I'd buy old furniture or, beat up stuff left over from a
Part of a bus.
Part of a bus, a piece of a diner, a restaurant booth. I buy a whole booth for $8. And plaster, plaster was then about 8 cents a pound.
There is some story about a one-time student of yours, who came with, I guess, plaster-impregnated bandages. Is that accurate, and how did that occur?
I was teaching a painting class in a local community center. So, one of the women in the class had a husband who was a research chemist who had just developed this new material in Johnson & Johnson, which is local to New Brunswick. And they offered me $50 to play with it, gave me a big free supply, and would I write up arts and crafts projects for kids. And I never took the $50. I took the free bandage, plaster-impregnated bandage, and took it home and instantly I had my wife cover me head to foot. With that
Had you been doing life casting before that?
No.
So you and those bandages were the first instance of that?
Yes. Yeah, because I had made about 11 handmade, hand-built figures, and I was too impatient. I had too many ideas to spend the 2 or 3 months to finish and meticulously. I was interested in realistic proportions, but for another purpose, not for a Renaissance purpose, but to punctuate my own real space. So I had a lot of ideas, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time on meticulous technique, because I had come from art school where I said, oh, it's ridiculous, you don't have to spend all that energy proving that you can draw. I sort of twisted the abstract expressionist injunction to, I can model, I can draw, I've had all that art training, but I felt and I feel, it's very often beside the point.
How important is the decor that your figures are situated in?
What you call the decor is critical to the work. The figure is a single element in the entire space. Figure is only one of the things that punctuates the space, so that I work a long time and there's nothing I can subtract after a while. Whatever is left there has to be there.
Are the figures a metaphor for something? What is the comment that you are making?
Yes, they're a metaphor, and no, I won't tell you.
Well, several people who have written about you and your work, including, I think it was Martin Friedman, who first saw the bus driver as Sharon leading us to wherever it is you think we're going. Jan van der Mark says that you are not informed by Rodin. Albert Elson, who has written at great length about Rodin, says that you are obviously concerned, I guess, with the same subdivisions of the body.
Well, you can keep going on. John Kennedy wrote extensively about the connection between me and Degas. Pinchas Witten wrote extensively about my connection with Hopper.
Was Hopper one of the traditions that you were influenced by? Because your work has not only been compared to sculptors, interestingly enough, to painters as well, such as Hopper.
To be honest, my answer has to be yes to everything. If I go through that list, other people have referred. It's ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt is pretty important to the way I resolve or try to resolve things. A lot of Greek ideas are very interesting. Michelangelo and even Rodin, etc., et al. All that stuff is. I find myself bumping in to the history of art that I love when I work. I don't know.
Are the figures every man?
Are they every man? Yes, they are, but I'm very perverse and contradictory because I want the figures to be quite specific to the person who poses. And quite specific means...
A woman at an ironing board.
Well, if you say every man, that implies a generalization. Sure, I'm interested in generalization. And I think that specific information and the specific truth about a particular individual is incredibly important also. I don't think it's an either-or choice.
Was your original impulse to make a total environment?
Yes. See, I remember it was somewhere early on. Capro and I had done a lot of talking about Jackson Pollock's paintings looking like limitless or infinite universes. And we were talking about space, enveloping space. I saw I think it was the Rothko retrospective at the Modern that absolutely floored me in its beauty. Rothko had divided the Modern, or the space for his show, into a succession of very small rooms, and he hung his paintings very close together, and it looked like luminous bands of light shining from the wall, and people never looked more beautiful to me than they did in those rooms. So it was a peculiar thing, poor Mark. And so I go there and I go see his show, and I'm absolutely flabbergasted by how beautiful people looked. That had a big effect. So the environment thing was, if you're going to change the ground rules arbitrarily, you make it up. Step forward from the canvas. So here's yourself, and there's the canvas on the wall. It's really dealing with the space between you and the wall. And it's inside a room. It doesn't have to be inside a room. It can be anywhere. Where's the limit? Where's the boundary? I don't know. But you make a move or a couple of moves in the space to intensify it. And you are free to walk around. It's like being very literal about cubism. It's being very literal about a lot of ideas in modern art.
After that initial experience with your wife wrapping you with those bandages, was it then that you decided to use your body and those of your friends to cast with?
Oh, yes.
How did that all evolve?
Well, I was interested in the reportage. I wanted first I thought that plaster casting would be a shortcut, speed up of technique.
You have to spend 40 minutes per part of the body.
Well, anyway, Helen covers me from head to foot with the plaster bandage stuff. I knew nothing about the fact that plaster sticks to hair, and I'm hairy from head to foot. So it was like pulling off a giant Band-Aid. Pulled it together. But after I put the thing together, I made a strange discovery that certain details came out exquisitely well. And I'd been taught, or it's been part of the literature for years, that plaster casting is cheating. That you have to draw from nature. If you're a Renaissance artist, your success is measured by how closely you resemble the object that you're copying, but don't use any photographic techniques. Then I discovered, Vermeer used photography, Degas used photography, so all the way through the history of art, like I saw all this evidence.
Do you ever use photographs as a preliminary to your work?
No. I just worked directly in the body, and then I discovered, then I began to discover something else that...
But I meant photographs of environments.
I just get real things. The real thing has a size and a presence that I need, so I've got to work full scale, full size. Don't have to draw. I have to just go at it. I have to...
Do you think of yourself as an abstract as well as a representational artist?
Yes, very much. Very much. I think it's necessary. It's necessary to deal in abstraction. I have been questioning most of my life how people arrive at abstractions.
Do you have any conclusions? Any interim conclusions?
Well, it's pretty obvious. I can't subtract. I can't direct experience from the conclusions that anyone arrives at. I think they're a bundle that must be tied together.
Until now, your figures have been of almost a dead white plaster. You, of late, have begun to use intense colors that, at least for me, are reminiscent of some of your early paintings.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
How did you manage to see my early paintings? Very few, about 12 people in the world know those early paintings. How'd that come about?
How are you going to use the color on plaster? Is it a stain, a transfer technique? Can you tell us about that?
Look, it's pretty obvious. I did admit I'm as interested in abstraction as I am realism. The peculiar combination of what goes on outside my skin plus what I'm aware of inside is what I want the work to look like. So it's going to be a contradictory collection of all that stuff. The colors and the way I handle the colors are very potent. I haven't explored it, and I'm restless. So I just try it.
How significant are words in your sculpture?
I have an enormous respect for words. I do love poetry. I do love good literature. When I started working, realistically, the furious objections that the abstract expressionist painters made were an indication. If I was going to reintroduce subject matter, I wanted that subject matter to be on the highest level of the literature I admired most. So I do like words, and I think that they're valid, they can be used beautifully, they can be used poetically, and words, talking, writing are as valid as they've always been.
To the work of what other painters or sculptors do you most respond? I
have a great friendship with the artists of my generation, say even the pop artists. We're Oldenburg, Dine, Lichtenstein, Johns, Rauschenberg. We know each other. I respect their work enormously. I think that critical definitions of pop art were too limited. They were never quite broad enough to handle the range of what all these artists were interested in.
Do you have more regard for pop art now than the period when you lived through it?
My regard for my artist friends never flagged. My regard for the partying, the fashion types, the socialite types, the hysteria of art critics who were supposed to make profound or long-lasting judgments and deluded themselves. I wasn't interested in the parties. I wasn't interested in the hysteria, the discotheques. The rock music was terrific at a certain point, and then it degenerated very badly. But at a certain point, it was of incredibly high quality. There was nothing wrong with the art that was produced. I think that the problem was with the audience.
And how do you feel about the audience now?
Quite relieved. I'm relieved, but it's a painful situation. That it took 3 assassinations, almost the beginning of a civil war, generation fight, and now the threat of economic disaster. It's very hard to get a job for young kids, and the grimness and the grown-upness. That's for me to be an old patriarch worrying about these things. I don't like to see everybody else like that. So that there is a different aura now. People are much more for real.
Since 1945, since the end of World War II, the definition of sculpture has changed considerably to encompass not only painting, but I guess the involvement of all the senses. How would you define sculpture?
I won't. I'll hide behind generic. If definitions of art change, it's only for the convenience of people driven to make their own statements of their own experience.
Did you ever think of casting the ideal man or the ideal woman? There's an idea.
Barbara Lee, all right, I'll get them's fighting words.
With a very special gift from an extraordinary human being. Thank you for being with us, George Segal, and thank you, too.